The vampire king of Ashenfall didn't trust anyone with his daughter, so he had cameras in her room to watch the new maid. What he saw on the tapes wasn't just shocking, it changed the course of his entire reign. Valar Dravenmore never imagined that hiding enchanted crystals within the shadows of his own fortress would reveal a secret that would shatter his 800-year-old heart. Widowed by a brutal ambush, the vampire king of Ashenfall hired Mireia, a quiet girl with no lineage, to care for his infant daughter, Lysara. The child, the only living piece of his human queen, had been left paralyzed from the waist down after the same attack that claimed her mother. Suspicious, protective, and consumed by a cold paranoia, Valar installed secret surveillance throughout the West Wing to monitor every breath the maid took. But what he witnessed through those magical lenses was not the betrayal he feared. It was a truth so powerful it would force him to choose between his crown and his soul. Welcome back to the Keep, my beautiful family and friends. If the mystery of the King's cameras has you hooked and you're ready to see how this story unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now. Also, leave a comment below letting me know which corner of the world you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another tale of secrets and shadows that you absolutely cannot miss. Now, let us begin. Valar Dravenmore woke every evening at sunset to the same recurring nightmare. The smell of burning carriage wood, the spray of silver-tipped arrows, and the screams, always the screams of his queen. He would open his eyes in the suffocating silence of his stone chambers and, for a few heartbeat-less seconds, forget that she was gone. Then, the weight of his immortality would hit him like a physical blow, and he would rise to face the daughter the tragedy had left behind. Lysara was only a babe when the ambush occurred on the road to the coast. Her mother died instantly. Lysara survived, but the damage to her spine was absolute. The most gifted blood healers and sorcerers in the realm had all declared the same verdict. She would never walk. Valar refused to believe them, yet every night, as he looked at her still legs in the cradle, he felt his hope turning to ash. It was the hour of deep moonlight when he entered the nursery. The princess was awake, staring at the Gothic arches of the ceiling with the same bright, curious eyes her mother once possessed. Valar lifted her, her tiny body feeling impossibly fragile in his powerful, clawed hands. Lysara didn't cry. She had grown eerily quiet, as if she sensed that the world was too dangerous a place for a child who could not run. The seventh nursemaid had fled the castle just yesterday, terrified of the king's temper and the burden of a broken heir. Valar was alone again, trying to balance the ruthless politics of his court with the delicate needs of a child who was fading before his eyes. His rule was suffering, his generals were whispering of his distraction. That was why, when Mireia Ashvale stood before the iron gates on a gray Tuesday, he could hardly believe his luck. She was young, modest, with dark hair and a calm that felt out of place in a house of monsters. She wore a simple white apron over a tan dress, her hands steady and her gaze respectful but unyielding. "I have come for the position," she said, her voice soft but certain. Valar led her in, explaining the gravity of the situation. Lysara required more than care, she required a shield. He had seen dozens of women fail. Mireia listened in silence, then asked to see the child. In the nursery, Mireia knelt beside the cradle. She didn't bow to the king. She smiled at the girl. "Hello, little star," she whispered. To Valar's shock, Lysara reached out a tiny hand and laughed. It was the first sound of joy to echo in that room in months. "I will stay," Mireia said, never breaking eye contact with the princess. Valar agreed immediately, driven by a desperate need to see his daughter happy. But that night, as the sun began to set, he paced his study. There was something about Mireia, a stillness, a hidden depth, that unsettled him. It wasn't quite distrust, but the terror of leaving his only weakness in the hands of a stranger. By midnight, his decision was made. He retrieved 6 enchanted crystals, magical lenses that could record every movement and sound, and began embedding them into the walls of the nursery. He needed to be sure. He needed to know Lysara was safe. But the footage Valor captured over the next few weeks would do more than just prove Mireya's innocence. It would unveil a hidden world of ancient healing and a devotion that defied the laws of his kingdom. To understand why these recordings changed him, one must first understand the secret history of the order Mireya was born to protect. The heavy iron gates of Ashenfall keep groaned, a sound like a dying beast echoing through the mist-choked valley. Valor stood on the balcony of his study, his eyes, cold as frozen rubies, tracking the small, solitary figure walking up the winding stone path. She looked small against the backdrop of the jagged black spires, a single drop of warmth in a sea of Gothic shadows. This was Mireya Ashvale. To any other observer, she was merely a girl seeking work in a fortress that most people spent their lives trying to avoid. But to Valor, she was a variable, a potential threat, a necessity. When she finally stood in the Great Hall, the contrast was even more jarring. The hall was a cavern of vaulted arches and flickering candlelight that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. Mireya stood in the center of the marble floor, her attire modest and practical, a tan, short-sleeved dress and a crisp white apron. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that held a startling, expressive warmth, a look that hadn't been seen within these walls since the Queen's funeral. Valor descended the grand staircase, his movements fluid and predatory, his long black coat trailing behind him like a shadow. He stopped 3 paces from her, allowing his presence to fill the room, a weight of 8 centuries of command designed to make even the bravest knights bow. Mireya did not bow. She didn't even flinch. She simply looked up at him, her hands folded gently in front of her. "You are Mireya," Valor said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the stillness. "You seek to serve the House of Dravenmore?" "I seek to care for the princess, my lord," she corrected softly. Her voice had a grounded quality, like the earth itself. "I heard, she has need of a steady hand." Valor narrowed his eyes, searching for the telltale flicker of pulse at her throat that signaled fear. There was none. "Many have come before you, Mireya. Women with better references, healers with greater reputations. All of them fled. They found the silence of this keep too heavy, or my daughter's condition too burdensome." "A child is never a burden," Mireya replied calmly. "And silence is only heavy if you are afraid of what you might hear in it." The king's lip curled slightly, not quite a snarl, but a warning. "I do not tolerate incompetence. I do not tolerate prying. You will clean, you will tend to the princess's physical needs, and you will stay within the designated wings. Do you understand the stakes? If a single hair on her head is harmed through your negligence, the sun will never rise for you again." "I understand," she said, her expression unchanging, her gaze steady. It was the look of someone who had seen things far more terrifying than a vampire's threat. "May I see her now?" Valor led her to the west wing, his suspicion mounting with every silent step she took. He opened the heavy oak doors to the nursery. The room was beautiful but sterile, filled with ornate furniture and silent toys that Lasara could not use. The infant princess sat in her crib, propped up by silk pillows. Her legs lay motionless beneath a blanket of lavender wool. When the doors opened, Lasara didn't turn her head. She remained staring listlessly at a silver mobile that hung above her. Mireya didn't wait for Valor's permission. She walked across the room, her footsteps light on the rug. As she approached the crib, she began to hum, a low, melodic vibration that seemed to harmonize with the very air. "Hello, little star," Mireya whispered. Valor watched from the shadows of the doorway. He saw the exact moment it happened. Lasara's head turned. Her dull eyes suddenly brightened, focusing on Mireya's face. A small, gurgling sound escaped the child's throat, a vocalization Valor hadn't heard in weeks. Then, slowly, the corners of Lasara's mouth tucked upward. She smiled. It was a small miracle, a puncture wound in the shroud of grief that governed the room. Valor felt a sharp, agonizing twist in his chest. He was the king, the father, the protector, and yet his daughter looked at this stranger with a recognition she rarely granted him. He turned his gaze toward the wall sconce, where a tiny, enchanted crystal was embedded behind the bronze filigree. Through his mental link to the surveillance system, he saw the scene again from a high angle. The maid's gentle posture, the child's reaching hands. The image was clear, clinical, and haunting. "The girl seems to like you," Valor said, his voice tight. "The position is yours. There is no trial period. You begin now." "I accept," Mireia said, her attention already back on Lasara. She reached into the crib and gently stroked the baby's cheek. "We have a lot of work to do, don't we, princess?" Valor retreated, without another word. He spent the rest of the night in his darkened study, the only light coming from the shimmering magical projections floating in the air before him. He didn't review reports from the border or sign the execution orders his ministers had left for him. Instead, he watched the West Wing feed. He watched Mireia move about the room with an efficient, rhythmic grace. He watched her talk to Lasara as if the infant understood every word. He watched her pick up a silver pot and a wooden spoon, making a soft drumming sound that made Lasara laugh again. He looked for a slip-up. He looked for a moment of cruelty, a sign of greed, or the telltale shimmer of a hidden weapon. He looked for a reason to cast her out. But as the hours ticked toward dawn, Valor found himself leaning closer to the images. He saw Mireia pick up the child and hold her, not with the practiced distance of the previous nurses, but with a genuine, radiating warmth. For 8 centuries, Valor Dravenmore had believed that control was the only way to ensure safety. He believed that if he could see everything, he could prevent everything. But as he watched Mireia whisper into his daughter's ear, a tiny, terrifying crack appeared in his certainty. He didn't know who this woman was, or why his daughter responded to her soul. But for the first time since the ambush, the crushing weight of his paranoia was met with a flicker of something even more dangerous. Curiosity. He reached out, his cold fingers brushing the projection of Mireia's face. "Who are you, Mireia Ashvale?" he whispered to the empty room. "And what are you doing to my house?" The sun began to bleed over the horizon, forcing him to close the heavy velvet curtains. But even as he lay in his coffin for the day's rest, the image of his daughter's smile followed him into the dark. The daylight hours were a forced exile for Valor, a period of restless dormancy spent behind reinforced stone and velvet. But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Ashenfall peaks, he did not head for the throne room to hear the petitions of his restless court. Instead, he returned to the flickering blue glow of the surveillance crystals in his private sanctum. He told himself it was vigilance. He told himself that a king who fails to watch his enemies is a king who invites the blade. But as he swiped his hand through the air, bringing the nursery feed into sharp focus, he knew he was looking for something more elusive than an assassin. Through the lens, the nursery looked different. The sterile, museum-like quality of the room had been disrupted. Mireia was on the floor, not kneeling, but sitting cross-legged on the thick rug, eye to eye with the princess. Lasara was propped up in a specialized seat Mireia had fashioned from rolled silk and cushions. Valor watched, his brow furrowed, as the maid reached for a pair of silver serving pots she had brought from the kitchens. She didn't use them for cooking. With a playful flourish, she inverted one and placed it on her head like a knight's helmet. She gave the other to Lasara, placing the child's small, uncoordinated hands on the rim. "The March of the Silver Dawn," Mireia murmured, her voice carrying through the magical feed with crystalline clarity. She began to tap a rhythm on the pot with a wooden spoon. It wasn't a random noise. It was a complex, syncopated beat. Then, she began to sing. Valor stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. The language was melodic, filled with soft fricatives and vowel shifts that hadn't been heard in the mortal realms for 5 centuries. It was a dialect of the old kingdoms, a civilization Valor had seen rise and fall long before the current map was ever drawn. How? He wondered, his fingers digging into the mahogany of his desk. How does a common cleaning girl from the outer villages know the songs of the Sunwalkers? But his suspicion was quickly eclipsed by wonder. As Mireia sang, she began a game. She took Lasara's limp legs and moved them in time with the music. To a casual observer, it looked like a simple dance, a maid playing with a doll. But Vaylor's ancient eyes saw the truth. Mireya's thumbs were pressed firmly into specific nerve clusters behind Lysara's knees. She was rotating the ankles with a precise, circular tension, her fingers fluttering over the muscles of the thighs with the rhythmic pressure of a master healer. "One step for the moon, little star," Mireya sang, her voice rising in a haunting crescendo. "Two steps for the sun. The earth is waiting for your feet to find their way home." Then the impossible happened. On the screen, Lysara's right foot gave a sharp, involuntary twitch. It wasn't a spasm. It was a response. The child's eyes widened, her tiny chest heaving with the effort of the game. A moment later, the left toes curled against the silver surface of the pot. Vaylor surged to his feet, the heavy chair clattering behind him. He stared at the projection, his heart, usually a silent, dormant thing, thudding against his ribs. The royal physicians had spent months poking the princess with silver needles, applying leeches and burning pungent herbs, only to declare the nerves dead. Yet here, under the guise of a nursery rhyme and a kitchen utensil, the dead was beginning to stir. Suspicion, sharp and cold, flooded back into his mind. Healing of this magnitude was rarely the result of mere talent. It was often the mark of a gifted, beings who traded years of their lives or the blood of others for the power to mend. Was Mireya a spy sent by the Sun Church? Was she an operative of the Southern Covens, weaving a long-form curse that looked like a cure? He watched her for hours. He watched as she turned a simple silk scarf into a flying dragon, using the movement to encourage Lysara to reach upward, strengthening the core muscles of her lower back. Every action was a hidden therapy. Every laugh from the child was a measurement of progress. "You are too good, Mireya," Vaylor whispered, his eyes narrowing. "No one is this selfless without a price." Driven by a sudden, frantic need for answers, Vaylor strode to the back of his sanctum and pulled a heavy, iron-bound lever. A hidden door groaned open, revealing the king's private archive, a collection of scrolls and ledgers that predated the keep itself. He tore through the records of the outer villages, searching for the name Ashvale. He found nothing. No birth records, no family lineages, no taxes paid. She was a ghost. He moved deeper into the archives, his movements becoming more frantic as the night wore on. He pulled down the Forbidden Annals, a collection of texts regarding the sects and orders that the vampire kings had dismantled during the Unification Wars. He spent the final hours of the night hunched over a crumbling scroll written in the same tongue Mireya had been singing. It spoke of the Luminara Sanctum, an order of scholars who believed that the body was a map of the soul, and that by realigning the song, one could knit bone and wake the sleeping limb. They were an order of peace, but they were also the only ones who had ever successfully resisted the Dravenmore expansion. Vaylor's ancestors had been told the sanctum was eradicated. They had been told the knowledge was burned to ash. He looked back at the surveillance projection. Mireya was now rocking Lysara to sleep, her head resting against the crib's railing, her own eyes closed in exhaustion. She looked so human, so fragile, sitting there in her simple tan dress. But Vaylor knew better. She was a remnant of a forgotten world, a survivor of a war he had inherited. She was either his daughter's savior or the most sophisticated weapon ever smuggled into his home. The conflict in his chest was a war of its own. Part of him wanted to storm into the nursery, seize her by the throat, and demand to know her true name. But another part, the part that had just seen his daughter's toes curl for the first time, wanted to fall to its knees and beg her to never stop singing. As the first hint of gray light touched the edges of the curtains, Vaylor extinguished the projections. The room fell into darkness, but the image of Mireya's hands stayed burned into his mind. "If you are a lie," he murmured into the shadows, "I will destroy you. But if you are the truth, then I am the one who is truly lost." He retreated to his resting place, but for the first time in centuries, sleep did not bring the nightmare of the ambush. It brought the sound of a wooden spoon against a silver pot, and the terrifying, beautiful hope of a child's first step. The dust of the archives tasted like centuries of forgotten blood. Valor sat amidst a wreckage of vellum and ink, his fingers trembling as he smoothed out a map of the world as it had existed 300 years ago. There, in the golden valley between the Ashenfall peaks and the sea, lay a small, unfortified, labeled Luminara Sanctum. As his eyes traced the name, a memory, sharp and jagged as a shard of glass, cut through the fog of his long life. He saw himself, younger, encased in black plate armor, standing on a ridge overlooking that same valley. He hadn't pulled the triggers or swung the blades that day. He had merely signed the decree of total integration. In the language of kings, that was a polite term for erasure. The Luminara were not warriors. They were healer scholars who possessed a terrifying power, the ability to understand the body's internal song. The vampire lords of the era had demanded that the sanctum weaponize their knowledge, to learn how to stop a heart as easily as they started one, to turn healing into a method of torture that never allowed a victim to die. The sanctum had refused. And so, Valor had ordered their silence. They were supposed to be gone, Valor whispered, his voice echoing hollowly against the stone. He pulled a hidden ledger from the bottom of a lead-lined chest, the records of the survivors. It was a list of names, most crossed out with a single, brutal red line. At the very end, written in a cramped, hurried hand, was a notation, Apprentice M.A. Status, unaccounted for. Likely perished in the Great Fire. M.A. Mireia Ashvale. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a girl from the villages. She was a living ghost, a fragment of a masterpiece he had helped to destroy. She was in his house, touching his daughter, using the very techniques he had tried to extinguish. Valor's mind raced with the cold logic of a sovereign. She should be executed. Her existence was a defiance of the Dravenmore law. But then, he looked back at the surveillance crystal's projection, which he had kept active in the corner of his eye. The scene in the nursery was peaceful, yet it felt like a betrayal. Lasara was sitting up, her back straighter than it had ever been. Mireia was showing her how to pick up small wooden blocks, her touch lingering on the child's wrists to stimulate the nerves. But it was the look on Lasara's face that caused the most pain. It was a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. Valor rose and walked toward the nursery, his footsteps heavy. He needed to see it for himself, without the mediation of the crystals. He pushed the doors open, his presence a dark cloud in the sunlight-drenched room. Lasara didn't even look up. Usually, when Valor entered, the child would offer a small, fearful twitch of recognition, acknowledgement of the towering shadow that was her father. Today, she was laughing. She was leaning into Mireia's side, her small hand clutching the maid's tense sleeve, as if it were an anchor. Lasara, Valor said, his voice straining for a softness he didn't feel. The child glanced at him for a fleeting second, her smile faltering, before she turned back to Mireia and buried her face in the girl's shoulder. The rejection was silent, but it cut deeper than any silver blade. Valor felt a surge of possessive rage, followed immediately by a sickening wave of guilt. He had built this castle to be a fortress, a place where no one could hurt his daughter. But in doing so, he had made it a tomb. He had provided her with the finest healer's money could buy, but he had never provided her with this. Mireia looked up, her expression calm, though her eyes were wary. She adjusted Lasara in her lap, her hands never ceasing their subtle, rhythmic massage of the child's legs. "She is tired, my lord," Mireia said softly. "The work is hard on her." "The work," Valor repeated, his voice dangerously low. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over them both. "You speak of it as if it were a craft, a discipline." Mireia's gaze did not waver. "It is a necessity. The body wants to be whole, my lord. It only needs someone to remind it how." Valor wanted to scream that he knew where those words came from. He wanted to tell her that he had seen the smoke rising from her temple. He wanted to ask her why she was here, if she was seeking revenge by stealing the heart of his child. But as he looked at Lasara's legs, legs that were now warm to the touch, no longer the cold, marble still limbs of a statue. The words died in his throat. He saw the calluses on Mireya's hands. They weren't the marks of a warrior. They were the marks of someone who had spent years in the dirt, healing the small and the broken, hiding her light so that it wouldn't be extinguished again. He realized then that Mireya wasn't weaponizing her magic. She was doing something far more subversive. She was practicing compassion in a house of stone. Continue, Valor managed to say, the word feeling like ash. He turned and walked out, but he didn't go back to his study. He stopped in the hallway, leaning his head against the cold stone wall. For 800 years, he had been a king of shadows. He had ruled through fear and surveillance, believing that trust was a luxury for the weak. But as he heard Lysara's laughter through the closed door, a sound that was becoming increasingly exclusive to the maid, Valor felt a terrifying shift in his own soul. He was the king of Ashenfall, the most powerful being in the realm. And yet, he felt like a beggar watching a feast through a window. He had the cameras, he had the guards, he had the power of life and death. But Mireya had the one thing he had surrendered centuries ago. She had the power to make his daughter want to live. The guilt of the past began to bleed into the paranoia of the present. He had destroyed her people because they wouldn't serve his war. Now, she was saving his daughter, and she didn't even know she was serving the man who had signed her order's death warrant. He returned to his sanctum and looked at the blue light of the surveillance crystals. They felt different now. Less like a shield, and more like a stain. I am watching a saint through the eyes of a thief, he whispered. He should tell her. He should confess. But the fear that had ruled him since his wife's death held him fast. If Mireya knew who he really was, what he had done to the Luminera, she would leave. And if she left, Lysara would go back into the dark. Valor sat in the flickering blue glow, a king trapped in a cage of his own making, watching the woman he had tried to erase rewrite the fate of his bloodline. The blue glow of the surveillance crystals had become Valor's primary sun. In the weeks that followed the revelation of the Luminera records, he found himself neglecting the business of his kingdom to witness the quiet revolution taking place in the West Wing. Through the flickering projections, he watched a miracle unfold in slow motion. Lysara was no longer the porcelain doll he had carried in a state of mourning. Under Mireya's constant, rhythmic care, the child had begun to claim her own body. It started with sitting. Mireya would place Lysara on the rug, supporting her lower back with just 2 fingers, whispering encouragement in that forbidden, melodic tongue. One evening, Valor watched as Mireya slowly withdrew her hand. For 1 heartbeat, then 10, then a minute, Lysara remained upright, her spine a straight line of pure defiance. Then came the crawling. It wasn't the fluid motion of a healthy babe, but a determined, dragging scramble. Mireya would place a wooden bird just out of reach, and Lysara would pull herself forward, her legs, once dead weight, now twitching with a spark of returning intent. Good, my little star. Mireya's voice would drift through the magical feed. The earth is your friend. It wants to hold you up. The progress was so startling that word began to bleed into the court. Valor's ministers, sensing a shift in the king's mood, suggested a royal commendation for the maid. They proposed bags of gold, a title, or a formal banquet to celebrate the healer's touch. Valor summoned Mireya to his study to offer these rewards, hoping perhaps to buy a piece of her loyalty, or to ease the stinging guilt that sat in his chest like cold lead. The court is impressed, Mireya, Valor said, standing by the tall windows. Your play has done what the finest blood healers could not. Name your price. Land, gold, jewelry, it is yours. Mireya stood in the center of the room, her hands tucked into the pockets of her tan apron. She didn't look at the gold coins on his desk. She looked at him. I didn't come for gold, my lord. And I didn't come for titles. Then why are you here? Valor's voice dropped, the predator in him sensing a motive he couldn't quantify. Because Lysara was lonely, Mireya said simply. And a child who is lonely will never find the strength to walk. I want nothing but to stay until she no longer needs me. She turned and left before he could dismiss her. Valor watched her go, feeling a strange, hollow ache. She was refusing the very things that defined his world: power and recognition. The jealousy began to fester alongside his gratitude. He started visiting the nursery in person, but he no longer announced himself. Using his vampire speed to move like a ghost, he would stand in the deep shadows of the hallway or the alcoves of the nursery, watching them through the cracked door. He saw things the cameras couldn't fully capture. He saw the way Lysara's eyes searched for Mireia the moment she woke. He saw the way the child laughed at a simple face Mireia made, a laugh so pure it made Valor feel like an intruder in his own home. He felt replaced. He was the king of Ashenfall, the father of the realm, yet he was a stranger to the only person who mattered. He was a spectator to a love that had grown without his permission. One evening, the tension between his surveillance and her intuition nearly snapped. Mireia was tidying the room while Lysara napped. She was humming a low, droning note, a clearing song of the Luminera. As she reached up to polish the bronze wall sconce near the cradle, her hand paused. In his study, Valor froze. His heart didn't beat, but he felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. Through the camera feed, he saw Mireia's eyes narrow. She stared directly at the ornate filigree of the sconce, her fingers hovering just inches from the hidden enchanted crystal. She sensed it, not as a machine, but as a violation. Mireia's head tilted. She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the gargoyles carved into the ceiling, the shadows in the corners, and finally, the door where Valor stood hidden. She didn't find the lens, but the atmosphere of the room shifted. The warmth seemed to drain out of her posture, replaced by a rigid, defensive stillness. She pulled her hand back, her face clouding with a sudden, sharp realization. Valor watched her through the blue projection, his breath held in the dark. Mireia walked to the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling. She didn't speak, but her expression was one of profound unease. She wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing her shoulders as if a sudden chill had entered the keep. She turned toward the door, her eyes fixed exactly where Valor's hidden eyes were watching from the shadows of the hallway. "Is someone there?" she whispered. Valor didn't move. He didn't breathe. He watched her through the camera, and he watched her through the crack in the door, a double vision of his own deception. Mireia didn't wait for an answer. She crossed the room and picked Lysara up out of the crib, holding the sleeping child tightly against her chest. It wasn't a gesture of affection, it was a gesture of protection. She was shielding the child from the very walls of the castle. She sat in the rocking chair, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the empty air with a newfound, piercing suspicion. In his sanctum, Valor extinguished the blue light. The silence of the study was deafening. He had seen the look in her eyes, the look of a prey animal realizing it had walked into a trap. The love he had been watching felt suddenly obscene. He had been a voyeur of the most sacred thing in the world, a child's recovery. And now, the woman who had brought that miracle was beginning to feel the weight of his invisible gaze. "She knows," Valor murmured, his hands trembling on the arms of his chair. He knew he should go to her. He should tear the crystals from the walls and beg for her forgiveness. But the king in him, the paranoid, broken king who had lost his queen to a shadow, couldn't let go of the control. If he stopped watching, he was blind. And if he was blind, he was weak. He sat in the dark, caught between the king he had been and the father he wanted to be, while in the room nearby, Mireia Ashvale sat with a child in her arms, her heart racing with the terrifying certainty that she was being hunted by the very eyes that were supposed to be protecting her. The atmosphere in the West Wing had curdled. The air, once light with Lysara's budding laughter and Mireia's ancient songs, now felt thick and stagnant, like the breath of a tomb. Valor watched from his sanctum, his eyes fixed on the blue shimmer of the central projection. On the screen, Mireia was motionless. She was standing by the window, the pre-dawn mist swirling outside the glass, but her attention was fixed on the bronze wall sconce she had touched the night before. The suspicion that had sparked in her eyes had grown into a cold, hard flame. In the projection, Valor saw her reach out. Her movements were no longer the fluid, rhythmic motions of a healer. They were jerky, fueled by a rising, sickening realization. She didn't just polish the metal this time. She hooked her fingers into the filigree and pulled. With a sharp crack, the decorative casing snapped. A small, faceted crystal rolled out of the bronze housing and dangled by a thin silver wire. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic azure light, the heartbeat of a surveillance network. In his study, Valor felt a phantom pain in his chest, as if the wire were wrapped around his own throat. Mireia stared at the crystal. She didn't scream. She didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, she turned her head, looking at the other shadows in the room, the carved gargoyles, the hollows of the crown molding, the eyes of the painted portraits. She realized then that there was no corner of this room that was her own. Every time she had wept with joy at Lysara's progress, every time she had whispered a secret prayer to the fallen Luminera, every time she had bared her soul to the child, he had been there, a silent, invisible predator, feeding on her most intimate moments. Valor watched her face crumble. It wasn't the rage of a victim, it was the devastation of someone who had finally dared to believe in safety, only to find the floor was made of glass. Mireia looked directly into the dangling lens. Her eyes were red-rimmed, shimmering with a mixture of humiliation and grief. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave the camera was more piercing than any accusation. She reached up and, with a single, decisive jerk, tore the crystal from its wire. The projection in Valor's study went black. He scrambled to activate the other feeds, the hallway, the kitchen, the great hall, but he was met with a series of empty, static-filled frames. In her quiet fury, Mireia was moving through the wing, identifying the nodes of his paranoia and severing them. "Mireia, wait," Valor whispered to the empty air, his hand reaching out to touch the cold stone of his desk. By the time he gathered the courage to leave the sanctum and face her, the sun was beginning to touch the horizon. He moved through the keep with a frantic, desperate speed, his boots echoing like thunder in the silent halls. He burst into the nursery. The room was bathed in the pale, sickly light of dawn. The bronze sconce hung open like a wound. The toys were neatly arranged on the rug. The silk cushions were plumped. But the rocking chair was still. The crib was empty. Valor's heart, usually a dormant engine, gave a violent lurch. "Mireia?" Silence answered him. He turned and sprinted toward the servants' quarters, ignoring the startled looks of the few guards awakening for their shift. He reached Mireia's small, sparse room. The door was open. The bed was made. Her single tan dress, the one she had arrived in, was gone. She had left nothing behind. No note, no demands, no goodbye. He returned to the nursery, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was then that he heard it, a sound that shattered the last of his royal composure. Lysara was crying. It wasn't the soft, hungry whimper of an infant. It was a deep, soul-shattering wail of abandonment. The child was lying in the center of the play rug, where Mireia must have placed her before she fled. Lysara's small hands were clawing at the fabric, her eyes fixed on the door, screaming for the only person who had ever seen her not as a broken princess, but as a living soul. Valor knelt beside his daughter, reaching out to scoop her into his arms. But as he touched her, Lysara flailed, her tiny fist striking his chest. She looked at him, the king, the father, and saw only the stranger who had driven the light away. She wouldn't be comforted. She wouldn't be hushed. Valor stood in the center of the room, holding the screaming child, and looked at the surveillance room door at the end of the hall. For months, he had felt powerful in that room. He had felt like a god, watching over his kingdom. Now, the very thought of those blue crystals made him feel physically ill. They were obscene. They were the monuments of a man who loved his fear more than he loved his family. He had watched the most beautiful miracle of his life through a peephole, and in doing so, he had tainted it. The nursery, once a place of hope, now felt like a hollow shell. The castle felt colder than it had in 8 centuries. Valor looked down at Lysara, whose cries were softening into a jagged, exhausted sobbing. He had the footage. He had every moment recorded on stone and light. But he had lost the woman who made the moments real. I saw everything, Valor whispered into his daughter's hair, his voice breaking. And I understood nothing. He looked toward the iron gates in the distance, visible through the high window. The mist was clearing, but the road was empty. Mireia Ashvale was gone, and with her, the only heartbeat Ashenfall Keep had ever truly known. The silence that followed Mireia's departure was not a lack of sound. It was a physical weight. It pressed against the stone walls of Ashenfall Keep, snuffing out the warmth of every hearth and the light of every candle. Valor stood in the center of the surveillance sanctum, the blue glow of the remaining crystals reflecting in his eyes like the ghosts of his own sins. On the few active screens, he saw the regression in real time. Lasara would not eat. She would not play. She lay in her crib, her eyes fixed on the door, her tiny body becoming a statue once more. The flickers of movement in her legs, the miracle he had watched with such secret greed, had vanished. She was retreating into herself, a soul closing its shutters against a cold world. A roar of pure, self-loathing agony ripped from Valor's throat. He lashed out, his talons shredding the air. With a violent sweep of his arm, he smashed the central pedestal. Enchanted glass shattered, and the blue projections flickered and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. He tore the remaining crystals from the walls, crushing them into fine dust between his palms. He didn't need to watch anymore. He knew exactly what he had done. "My lord," a trembling voice spoke from the doorway. It was the High Chancellor, clutching a stack of urgent decrees. "The border disputes, the taxes from the Southern Reach. The court awaits your—" "The court can burn," Valor rasped, turning his head just enough for the Chancellor to see the raw, terrifying grief in his eyes. "Tell the council they rule in my stead. I am leaving." "Leaving? To where? For how long?" "Until I am a man worth following again," Valor said. He shed his royal mantle, leaving the heavy, fur-lined cloak on the floor of the sanctum. He took no crown, no guards, and no coin. Dressed in the simple, travel-worn leathers of a common wanderer, the king of Ashenfall walked out of his iron gates and into the mist. He traveled for weeks, his immortality feeling like a heavy chain. He moved through the outer villages where the name Dravenmore was spoken only in fearful whispers. He saw the ruins of the wars he had started and the refugee camps filled with people who had lost everything to the order he had spent centuries enforcing. He was a king without a throne, walking among the subjects he had never truly seen. He saw the grime under their fingernails and the hollow look of hunger in their eyes. For the first time, he felt the cold not as a creature of the night, but as a man who had no fire to go home to. Finally, in a sun-scorched settlement on the edge of the Dead Marches, a place where the shadows of the Luminara Sanctum still lingered in the architecture of the ruins, he found her. It was a makeshift clinic under a canopy of tattered gray silk. Mireia was there. She looked thinner, her tan dress stained with the dust of the road, but her posture held that same, unbreakable, quiet determination. Valor did not approach. He stood in the shadow of a crumbling archway, several hundred yards away. There were no cameras here. No enchanted crystals hidden in the walls. There was only his own vision, unmediated and raw. He watched as she knelt in the dirt beside a young boy whose arm was mangled from a mining accident. There were no tonics, no expensive salves. Mireia simply took the child's hand in hers. She began to hum, the same low, vibrating drone Valor had heard in the nursery. He watched her work for hours. She didn't just heal the boy's flesh. She spoke to him. She leaned in close, her forehead touching his, sharing his pain until the child's breathing slowed and his eyes closed in a healing sleep. She did this for one child, then an elderly woman, then a soldier from a rival house. Valor realized then that he had spent 800 years trying to master the world through the accumulation of power, while Mireia was mastering it through the surrender of herself. She had nothing, no fortress, no army, no hidden lenses, yet she held more authority in her gentle hands than he had ever possessed on his throne. He felt a profound, soul-stripping humility. He had been a voyeur of her grace because he was too cowardly to participate in it. He had watched her love his daughter from behind a screen because he didn't believe he was worthy of witnessing it face to face. As the sun began to set, Mireia stood and wiped the sweat from her brow. She looked exhausted, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the suffering she had absorbed. She turned her head toward the ruins where Valor stood. He didn't hide. He didn't use his speed to vanish. He stood in the light, a broken man in the dust of a fallen world. Mireia's eyes found him. She didn't scream and she didn't run. She simply stood there, the distance between them filled with the ghosts of the Luminera and the memory of a child's laughter. Valor took a single step forward, his heart, the one he thought had died with his queen, aching with a terrifying, newborn hope. He was no longer a king monitoring a subject. He was a father searching for a way home. The dust of the dead marches swirled between them, a grit-filled wind that tasted of ancient ass. Valor walked toward the silk canopy, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Around them, the refugees and the wounded stirred, sensing the arrival of a predator, but Valor's aura was not one of hunger. It was a vacuum of profound, quiet sorrow. Mireia didn't move. She stood with a blood-stained rag in her hand, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. As Valor came within 10 paces, the refugees began to recoil, recognizing the regal bearing even beneath the travel-worn leathers. A few men reached for rusted knives. "Let him pass," Mireia said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs. She didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes were locked on Valor. He is not here as a king today. There is no one behind him to catch his fall. Valor stopped. For the first time in centuries, he felt the true weight of the air on his skin. Without his throne, without his walls, he felt naked. "Mireia," he began, his voice cracking. "Why are you here, Valor?" she asked. She didn't use his title. There was no reverence in her tone, only a sharp, weary edge. "Did you lose the signal? Did the glass break? And now you've come to fetch the bird back for its cage." "Lasara is failing," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "She has stopped eating. She has stopped trying to move. The castle, it is a tomb again." Mireia's expression flickered with a brief, sharp pain, the love for the child warring with the memory of the betrayal. Then she hardened. "And what did you expect? You treated her recovery like a laboratory experiment. You watched us through the walls as if we were animals in a menagerie. You didn't want a daughter who could walk. You wanted a daughter you could control." "I wanted her safe," Valor countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No." Mireia stepped forward, her voice rising, drawing the eyes of every refugee in the camp. "You wanted to be safe from the pain of losing her. You chose control because you are a coward, Valor Dravenmore. You would rather watch a person through a lens than look them in the eye, because eyes require trust, and trust is the only thing your crown can't buy." The silence that followed was absolute. To speak to the vampire king this way was a death sentence. The onlookers held their breath, expecting the spray of red. Instead, Valor reached into the pocket of his tunic. He pulled out a single, jagged shard of blue crystal, the very last node of the surveillance system, the one he had kept as a literal piece of his paranoia. He looked at it for a moment, then held it out so Mireia could see the rhythmic azure pulse within. With a slow, deliberate squeeze of his hand, he crushed it. The blue light flared once, violently, then vanished into gray dust that slipped through his fingers and vanished into the dirt. Then, Valor Dravenmore, the king of Ashenfall, the scourge of the Southern Reach, did something that altered the history of his bloodline. He sank to his knees. He didn't bow his head in a warrior's submission. He kept his eyes on hers, his knees hitting the dry earth with a dull thud. He looked small. He looked human. "I am a coward," he confessed, the admission echoing off the ruins. "I have lived 800 years, and I have learned nothing but how to build walls. When my queen died, I died with her. I turned my heart into a fortress because I thought if I could see everything, I could never be hurt again." He took a jagged breath, his hands trembling against his thighs. But watching you, it wasn't just about protection. I watched you because you were the only thing in that castle that was alive. I was jealous of the way Lasara looked at you. I was jealous of the way you sang to the shadows. I hid behind those cameras because I didn't know how to ask for a place in the light you were building. Mireya's breath hitched. The rag in her hand dropped to the dust. I don't want a maid, Valor said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And Lasara doesn't need a nurse. She needs the woman who sees her as a soul. I am asking you to return, not as a servant, not as a subject. Return as her guardian. Return as my equal. Help me tear down the walls I've spent centuries building. Mireya looked down at the king kneeling in the dirt. She saw the dust on his expensive boots, the grief etched into the lines of his face, and the raw, terrifying honesty in his eyes. There was no magic here. No surveillance. Just two broken people in a broken world. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his shoulder before finally coming to rest there. Her touch was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold stone he was used to. If I come back, she said, her voice trembling, there will be no more glass between us. If you want to see your daughter walk, you'll have to stand beside me and hold her hand yourself. Can you do that, Valor? Can you live without the cameras? Valor reached up and took her hand, his cold fingers finding the warmth of hers. I would rather be blind and beside you both than see the whole world from a lonely throne. Mireya closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't pull him up. She knelt down with him, bringing them both to the same level in the dirt of the refugee camp. Then let's go home, she whispered. Our daughter is waiting. The return to Ashenfall Keep was not marked by the sounding of trumpets or the display of royal banners. Instead, it was a quiet procession through the iron gates, a king and a woman in travel-stained clothes, walking side by side as the mist parted before them.
The castle had changed.
The oppressive weight of the surveillance had lifted, but in its place was a fragile, expectant silence. The court elders and the high ministers gathered in the great hall, their faces etched with skepticism. They whispered behind their hands about the king's madness and the maid who had bewitched him. They looked at Mireya, now dressed in a simple gown of ivory linen, her posture regal not by birth, but by spirit, and saw an interloper. But Valor ignored them. He had eyes only for the child who sat in a high chair at the center of the hall. It was Lasara's second name day. The hall was filled with the scent of winter lilies and beeswax. Lasara looked pale, her movements sluggish, until the moment Mireya stepped into her line of sight. The transformation was instantaneous. The child's eyes ignited. A small, gasping cry of "yeah" escaped her lips, a fragmented attempt at Mireya's name that hit Valor harder than any spear. Mireya walked to the center of the hall. She did not look at the assembled nobles. She knelt on the cold marble, beckoning to the king. Valor, she said softly.
Come.
No cameras today. Just you. Valor stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt opposite Mireya, forming a bridge of two souls over the child between them. The prophecy of the fallen king, a court elder whispered from the shadows, says the line of Dravenmore would end in a child of stone. This is folly. Mireya ignored the voice. She placed her hands under Lasara's arms, but she didn't lift her. Instead, she began to hum that low, ancient drone, the song of the Luminara Sanctum. She looked at Lasara and nodded. The earth is ready, little star. Are you? With a trembling breath, Mireya slowly withdrew her support. The great hall fell into a silence so absolute that the flickering of the torches sounded like thunder. Lasara wobbled. Her small hands clutched at the air, searching for the familiar silk of her cradle. But then, her gaze locked onto Valor's face. She saw his tears. She saw the man who had stopped watching and started waiting. Lasara's right foot pressed flat against the marble. Then the left. With a grunt of pure, stubborn effort, the child of stone pushed upward. She stood. A collective gasp rippled through the court. The elders moved forward, their eyes wide. Lasara stood on her own two legs, her body shaking with the effort of centuries of dormant nerves finally firing into life. To me, Lasara, Valor whispered, his voice thick with a father's desperate hope. He opened his arms wide, his palms turned upward in a gesture of total vulnerability. Lasara took a step. It was clumsy and precarious. Then another. The marble floor, once a cold boundary, was now a path. She walked 5 steps, the longest journey in the history of the Dravenmore line, and collapsed into her father's chest. Valor let out a sob that shook his entire frame, pulling the child into the hollow of his neck. He looked up at Mireia, and in that moment, the king was gone. There was only a man who had been saved. Prophecies are only shadows of the past, Valor announced, his voice booming through the hall with a new, resonant authority. Today, Ashenfall Keep ceases to be a fortress of fear. The resolution followed with the speed of a spring thaw. Valor did not just dismantle the cameras, he dismantled the culture of the keep. He issued a decree that transformed the West Wing into the new hall of the Luminera, a sanctuary for healers and refugees from across the realms. Mireia was appointed High Healer of the realm, wearing the seal of the sanctum openly. She no longer cleaned the floors. She taught the court that power without compassion was merely a slow death. Years later, the keep was no longer a place of eternal night. Valor had ordered the heavy velvet curtains replaced with glass, and the gargoyles were softened by the growth of climbing ivy. The final image of the Dravenmore legacy was no longer a king on a lonely throne. Through the high, sunlit halls, the sound of rapid, rhythmic footsteps echoed. Lasara, now a vibrant young girl with hair like her mother's and a spirit like Mireia's, ran through the corridors. She didn't look back to see if she was being watched. She didn't need to. She ran toward the gardens where Valor and Mireia stood together, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that was finally, truly awake. The surveillance was gone. The trust had endured. And in the heart of Ashenfall, the only thing being monitored was the growth of a love that would outlast immortality itself.